Thank you. Constantijn Huygens was in England on 7 occasions during his life. He made 3 trips in his 20s, and he returned 4 times in his late 60s and 70s. 45 months in total he spent on English soil, and there's no question that his experience of the country and of the English influenced his life and shaped his personality. Letters provide invaluable glimpses into the experiences and impressions of a traveller. Sometimes, as in the case of the young Constantine's earliest English visits, they're brimful of detail because they're written to loved ones waiting at home, eager for news. If we combine these accounts Constantine wrote at the time with the memories he set out 60 years later in the autobiography he wrote for his children, what he was doing, what he was seeing, and with whom he was meeting, it all begins to come back to life. Over this, we can layer even more detail to Constantine's accounts by looking at letters written by other people living at the time and writing in the places that he was visiting. The database I work on, Early Modern Letters Online, helps us to do just this. As a young man, Constantine first travelled to London with the English ambassador Dudley Carleton. He was only 26 when he set out across the North Sea, and from the 7th of June to the 12th of November 1618, he lodged with the Dutch ambassador, Noel de Caron, in South Lambeth. Caron's residence was very grand and lay in extensive grounds on the south bank of the River Thames. You see it here on the right, halfway down. But his guest, Constantine, didn't find life there especially easy, and he lamented in his letters, "I live as far from London as The Hague is from Delft." He did have a long journey to the bridge to cross into London. It's about 3 kilometres on Google Maps. But as he walked, he got blisters, which then became infected. He had to see a physician, which was expensive, as was almost everything else in the country, Constantine complained. But things did look up for him. We know from letters that he visited Oxford and its Bodleian Library. He travelled to Cambridge. He attended a session of Parliament. He visited the ambassador Caron. He went to concerts, meeting people the while. He was honoured by an introduction to King James I, who went to the ambassador Caron's residence every year to pick cherries from his garden, climbing an especially padded ladder to do this job. Constantine was present for this annual fruit-picking ritual we read in the letters. He was permitted to kiss the king's hand, and he was asked to play his lute for James and his favourite, the Duke of Buckingham. When he returned to The Hague, Constantine travelled with the Anglican delegates who were to attend the Synod of Dort, each one an influential contact. Constantine's second trip... I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I think
Is that better?
the wind blowing in there.
Is that better? Thank you. Constantine's second trip, from the 23rd of January to the 30th of April 1621, was as part of an official diplomatic mission, the objective of which was to obtain the support of James I for his daughter Elizabeth and her husband, Frederick V of Bohemia, who'd been ousted from their lands and had fled to The Hague. Constantine was employed as a secretary. Although it was not an easy mission, he made time for pleasure. He renewed his friendship with the politician and soldier Edward Cecil. "Last Sunday," he writes, "I saw an excellent masque presented to the king by the Prince of Wales, and to which I had gained entry by the favour of Mr. Cecil, while the door remained closed to several other distinguished persons." He met the poet Raphael Thorius, the King's Latin secretary Thomas Reed, and the royal tutor Thomas Murray, as well as the formidable philosopher and Lord Chancellor of England, Francis Bacon. The third trip, which began later the same year, was Constantine's longest, from the 5th of December 1621 to the 13th of February 1623. Once again on diplomatic business, the mission, headed by François van Aersen, set out not only to persuade James not to favour the Spanish, but also to resolve one Anglo-Dutch conflict about fishing rights, as well as another between the English and the Dutch East India companies. Constantine's letters provided his parents with details of many delicate and confidential discussions, but he asked them to keep his words to themselves. He disliked the pretentiousness of the English, for example, and the complications they caused. And it's clear he was continually embarrassed by his worn-out clothes, as well as tired of seemingly endless shopping expeditions he had to do for his family. However, in the course of this shopping, he did meet the inventor Cornelius Drebbel, and he did purchase a pair of spectacles from him, as well as a camera obscura. But the most significant personal contact he made was with Sir Robert Killigrew and his wife Mary. Decades later, in his autobiography, Constantine recalled how the couple welcomed him into their house, and they introduced him to the playwright Ben Jonson and to the poet John Donne. Although the diplomatic mission was not especially successful, James bestowed a great honour on Constantine. On the 27th of October 1622, at Royston in Hertfordshire, he knighted him. But from another letter listed in my EMLO database, it was clearly terrible weather at the time. The inveterate purveyor of news and gossip, John Chamberlain, wrote to Constantine's old acquaintance Dudley Carleton, who was in The Hague, to inform him, "The roads are so impassable with floods that it is feared the king will not get well to Theobalds," which was a journey of no more than 60 kilometres due south. Despite his knighthood and a widening circle of friends, Constantine returned home with, as he confided to his parents in a letter, a sad heart. This may have been affected by the insurmountable problems inherent in his mission, or perhaps by worries about war back at home, or perhaps it was the depressing English weather, or many think it was his evident infatuation with Lady Killigrew. Just 2 weeks after the death, though, of his own father, Christian, in 1624, Constantine departed for London yet again on yet another diplomatic mission, headed by Albert Joachimi and again Francois van Ersen. This was his fourth trip between the 26th of February and the 5th of July, 1624. After an inauspicious start with a perilous journey by sea, negotiations proved much more productive this time, but again, it was not easy work. In EMLO, there's a letter of the 20th of March, 1624, written again from the gossipy John Chamberlain to Dudley Carleton, with the observation, "On any distraction in public business, the Spanish ambassadors parade the town and pay visits. They are said to have much secret correspondence with the court. The prince has scarcely vouchsafed to look at a present of 3 cartloads of provisions, fruits, and sweetmeats sent to him by the Countess Olivares." In addition to the political intrigues and jostlings that he encountered at every turn, it must have been grim for Constantine in mourning that year in London. Another letter, again from Chamberlain to Carleton, of the 10th of April, 1624, reveals the winter has been the severest in the memory of man. Although Constantine's letter diaries written for his mother Susanna on this trip have not survived, those she sent to him imply that he was ensconced again with the Killigrews. While from John Chamberlain's letters we learn that there was much canvassing going on in London about the making of captains and colonels for these new forces that are to be raised to assist the Low Countries. All these letters written by others in London begin to add just a few small brushstrokes to the broader background landscape of Constantine's adventures in England. Constantine didn't return to England for 39 years after this, during which period there was a civil war across the country, a king, Charles I, was beheaded, there was a decade of Commonwealth rule, most of it under the Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell, when the Stuart family and their supporters relocated to the continent, many to The Hague. And it was here that Constantine continued to meet with and correspond with many, many English and Scottish people. During these years, he was made a popular guest of Margaret and William Cavendish at the Rubens House in Antwerp. They made music together, and he exchanged scientific ideas with Margaret, including discussions about Prince Rupert's drops. These were toughened glass beads named after Rupert, the Queen of Bohemia's son. The mathematician John Pell was a close friend and correspondent of William Cavendish's brother, Charles. And Constantine shared friends with Pell, including Dr. Samuel Johnson, the English chaplain to the Palatinate Court in The Hague, and William Swan, who was married to Eutricia, Lady Swan, who was a talented musician and a lady-in-waiting to the new Princess of Orange, Mary Stuart. Pell, thanks initially to William Bosworth, who was the English resident with the States General, was selected in 1643 as Professor of Mathematics at the Gymnasium Illustre in Amsterdam. When the erudite Caspar Barlius' son married a rich heiress in July 1644, Barlius told Constantine in his letter of invitation that the wedding party would include knights, lawyers, governors of the Indies, and professors too. Did Constantine and Pell meet at this society wedding, we wonder? We know their paths continued to overlap, for by September 1646, the scholar G.J. Vossius was lamenting in a letter to John Sadler in London that our mutual friend John Pell had moved from Amsterdam to Breda to teach there at the École Illustre. In Breda, Pell taught at the school where Constantine was a governor and which his son, the mathematician Christian, attended. Following the restoration of Charles II as king in 1660 and the return to England of many of his followers, Constantine was in London a fifth time, from the 2nd of June to the 1st of October 1663, to negotiate with the new king for support of his nephew, Prince William III of Orange-Nassau, and to ensure repayment from the Stuarts of these long overdue moneys. Less is known of this trip from Constantine's letters, and he must have found, sadly, that many of his London friends were dead. However, we do know that he was travelling with his son, Christian, and that they went to a meeting at London's Royal Society. On the 10th of June 1663, the secretary of this very young scientific society, Henry Oldenburg, wrote to the chemist Robert Boyle to explain, "This afternoon we had no ordinary meeting. There were no less than 4 strangers, all 2 French and 2 Dutch gentlemen. The French were Monsieur de Sorbière and Monsieur Monconis, the Dutch both the Zulikhems, father and son, all 4 inquisitive after you." Although in a follow-on letter of the 22nd of June, Oldenburg tells Boyle, "On Wednesday last, there were admitted into the society my Lord Crawford Lindsay, Messieurs Huygens and Sorbière, there is no evidence, as yet, in the Royal Society's records that Constantine was also made a fellow. It seems to have been just Christian." Constantine was back in London on his 6th visit, between the 7th of June and the 2nd of October 1664. He'd been asked by Amalia von Solms to demand, yet again, repayment of the overdue loans. We know, too, that he carried letters from Christian for various contacts in the city. It's recorded in a letter of the 9th of June, 1664, from Robert Moray, who was one of the founding members of the Royal Society, that Constantine, within 2 days of arriving in London, had already delivered a letter to Moray from Christian Huygens. And we know from other letters from Moray that he saw Constantine regularly. On the 18th of July, Moray says he was passing scientific treatises to Constantine to deliver back home in The Hague to Christian. And in a letter of the 31st of July, Constantine is described as having been in touch with Moray and as having seen William Brouncker, the president of the Royal Society. And Christian wrote to Moray on the 8th of August relating that Constantine had seen a telescope at Mr. Reeves, a scientific instrument maker in London. Meanwhile, Constantine himself was writing to England's Secretary of State, Henry Bennet, Earl of Arlington, and to the Lord Chancellor, who was also the Chancellor of Oxford University, Edward Hyde, the Earl of Clarendon, as well as to the Lord Treasurer of England, Thomas Wriothesley, the 4th Earl of Southampton. And we know too that in September he paid a visit to the civilian professor of geometry in Oxford, John Wallis, who was also a member of the Royal Society. And on his way back to France, Constantine wrote an epigram on the occasion of this meeting. The final and 7th occasion Constantine was in London was between the 6th of November 1670, and the 11th of October, 1671. He was 74 years old by this time, and in the entourage of Prince William III, who was paying his uncle, Charles II, a courtesy call. Constantine's task was, yet again, yes, you've guessed it, to negotiate for the repayment of those Dutch loans. This time, a little progress was made when the outstanding dowry for Mary Stuart was paid. The letters tell us that Constantine stayed this time in the heart of London in Charing Cross, that he was treated with kindness and respect by both Charles II and his Queen Catherine, that he went to plays and ballets, to concerts and balls, he bought books and he read, he ate and drank like a prince, and he went to bed at midnight or later and slept late into the mornings. One letter in EMLO records, "The Dutch ambassador is still so gouty that he cannot make his entry, but whether this is Constantine remains to be seen." We'll have to ask Innika. These are just a few snippets from a tiny selection of the many, many letters that survive from this time. What we're hoping to do with the engagement of a group of scholars and students, both here in the Netherlands and in England at Oxford, is to compile even more inventories and descriptions of letters of the most significant people in Constantine's English circles, as well as more letters of others writing in the same locations at the same time. I suspect this is going to prove rewarding work, and I hope very much we'll be able to stitch together even more details and threads to bring alive Constantine's visits over the North Sea, as well as to the English circles in which he moved. Thank you very much.